How's everyone doing? By now, you know my name is Enya, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. For some context, this was a policy that was written in the wake of many corporate scandals, including, for example, the Enron scandal, which was where some external audits exposed that corporate officers of Enron were actually frauding financial documents and doing backroom deals to make it look like the company was doing well and inflate the stock price, while they were in fact getting money off the top. When this came out, the stock dropped from $90 all the way down to just $1. Investors lost basically all their money and became scared to invest in the market once again. If people aren't investing, this is actually bad for the market. So policymakers realized they needed to introduce a new way for investors to be safe so they will start investing again. This is where they came up with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which increased corporate oversight, make corporate officers liable for financial and tax documents. It made it so that audit companies couldn't provide other services like consulting for companies they were auditing. And it also provided oversight for HR firms. So with all that in mind, we also know that these kind of scandals also happen in the nonprofit world. And with that, knowing that, the question I was asked in this assignment was, should we implement Sarbanes-Oxley into the nonprofit sector? My initial reaction was absolutely. This is a policy meant to deal with corporate fraud. So why not use it to try to deal with some of the fraud among trustees and board members in the nonprofit world? For the sake of the assignment, the op-ed I created was the other side, which was actually defending the argument that we should not introduce the Sarbanes-Oxley Act into the nonprofit sector. The summary of the argument of my op-ed was essentially reframing the argument that this question wasn't an ethical question on whether we should have corporate oversight in the nonprofit sector, which is a thing I absolutely agree with, but rather whether Sarbanes-Oxley is actually the correct way to achieve that. And when you look at the numbers on how much it's costing small companies and in order to pay for compliance costs, it actually doesn't look like it's worth what it's achieving. The data is showing that costs are increasing every year. The hours it takes to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley are going up every year. And they're actually disproportionately affecting smaller companies more than any other types of company. This doesn't make sense when you realize that this policy was written with large mega corporations in mind and making sure that these corporate officers couldn't skim off the top. Then it shouldn't be costing small companies the most. There are automation tools being designed to reduce the cost of Sarbanes-Oxley, but they are still very expensive and they have a high initial investment cost, which most companies can't afford. So the vast majority of companies are just watching their compliance costs rise year after year. From this perspective, Sarbanes-Oxley isn't working in the private sector, so we shouldn't expect it to work in the nonprofit world either. In fact, it would probably have the same effect and end up costing the smallest nonprofits the most amount of money, which is not what we want out of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It was written in 2002, made sense then, but a lot has changed since then, and the policy has not been adapted to address that. Next, we're going to look at the two tweets I wrote. The first one is, thinking Sarbanes-Oxley should affect the nonprofit sector, consider this first. Compliance costs increased to over $500,000 for nearly three-quarters of all small companies in 2022. How many local nonprofits have a budget of even half that size? The second tweet was, we need a way to make sure large corporations follow the rules. And Sarbanes-Oxley is our policy for that. Problem is, it ends up costing smaller companies the most time and capital. SOX doesn't work in the private sector, so we shouldn't expect it to work for the nonprofit sector either. Both of these tweets follow the same kind of idea of being a piece combo. First, they bring sort of a provocative idea, whether we should introduce the Sarbanes-Oxley Act or the importance of corporate oversight. Then the second sentence sort of provides a shocking fact the reader might not have expected to sort of incite a little bit of an emotion, and then it redirects that emotion to a new idea. So about whether we should actually introduce this act in the nonprofit sector. And after you already sort of have a negative emotion against it, you're probably not leaning towards introducing the Sarbanes-Oxley into another sector. Next I'm going to talk about the data visualization. The first one is a graph showing the percentage increase for Sarbanes-Oxley compliance costs for companies of all different sizes. And as you can see, the costs increase for companies that are less than $500 million, which is the smallest bracket, by over 100%, 118% to be exact. This is far greater than any other bracket, which shows you that these costs are increasing much more for these smaller companies than for any other size of company. And in fact, at the end, you can see they're actually decreasing for the largest companies, which makes no sense. The second graph is a pair of graphs showing you how much Sarbanes, the compliance costs, the percentage of companies that saw their compliance costs go over a certain number, either 500,000 or 2 million. I included 500,000 to understand how the costs are changing for small companies. And we can see that over 50% of the smallest companies saw their compliance costs go over 500,000 in the left graph. You can see that on the leftmost section, how skewed the bar is, the blue one in 2021 compared to 2022. On the right, it shows the percent of costs that went over 2 million. And this is where we should see a change in the largest corporations. If their costs are really going up, a lot of companies should see these costs balloon over 2 million, but the figures stay the same. So for these largest corporations, their costs are roughly the same, but the smallest companies are again seeing their costs rise up exponentially. Next, I'm going to talk about the infographic. It's 5 quick details meant to convince you that Sarbanes-Oxley should not be in the nonprofit sector. The first one tells you that the compliance hours are going up and they're not getting, and the percentage of hours that are going up are not getting better year by year. The second one talks about the heavy cost of SOX compliance and how it affects smallest companies the most. The third one talks about how companies that have fewer locations, which are in general smaller companies, are also being affected more heavily. The fourth one talks about how work has changed so much since the pandemic and how the SOX policy was written well before that. And finally, the fifth talks about how the automation software is still very expensive and new, and the vast majority of companies simply can't afford it. Next, I'm going to reflect a little bit on this entire assignment. And I have to say, coming in, I thought it was pretty clear cut. The importance of corporate oversight is still really high, especially in the nonprofit world. And for that reason, we should have Sarbanes-Oxley. I was actually very surprised when I saw this data study by Productivity.com, which actually showed me the costs and how disproportionate they are towards smaller companies, and how I actually ended up with such a strong opinion in the other direction, where the argument I was only doing for the sake of the assignment ended up being my actual opinion, because when you look at the actual data, it's very clear that Sarbanes-Oxley is not doing its job right. So we shouldn't be applying it to the nonprofit world. And it made me realize, A, the importance of getting all the data in a specific situation before forming an opinion, but B, how you can actually really manipulate an argument just reframing the perspective of it. Finally, I want to end these with my references and just highlight the second bullet. This is again the productivity study I mentioned earlier, and this productivity study was by far the most detailed analysis of Sarbanes-Oxley costs, and I really have to credit the work they did in my study, in my assignment today. So thank you guys for listening to me today, and good luck in your presentations as well.